Imagine it's the near future. You leave your house and the air is clean and fresh. We've cut air pollution and worked together to restore the forests and ecosystems that we've lost over the past decades and centuries. Oceans are healthy again, thriving, teeming with life. Soils have regenerated, bursting with fertility, and producing bigger crop yields for everyone. And as you leave your house, you get in a car or bus that's clean and electric, and it takes you wherever you want to go. And the rooftops of the buildings around you are green and living, all doing their part to keep global temperatures low. So is this some impossible utopia? No, not at all. It's absolutely possible. And we already have the map that gets us there, the Paris Climate Agreement. And almost 200 countries have already signed on. Every 5 years, each nation has to report back on how they're reducing their carbon footprint and what they're doing to keep global temperatures from rising more than 1.5 degrees Celsius. These nations have to show how they are building resilience, saving lives, and protecting property against the increasing number of storms, droughts, and fires and floods. Signing on to the Paris Agreement is legally binding, and no one gets a pass, not even the biggest countries like China, India, Russia, the US, nor the small island states and the rest of the world. The Paris Agreement lets countries chart their own course to net zero emissions. It is up to nations, businesses, and people to find new ways of doing things. Everything from energy creation to transportation, manufacturing, and farming. This will spark a huge economic boom for the rest of the century. And it's already happening. New markets for everything from solar panels, electric cars, and energy-efficient appliances are creating greener jobs everywhere. This is personal for me. I don't want to choke on the air I breathe or see wildfires burning out of control. I don't want a world that is parched by drought. So for me and for everyone, the Paris Agreement is the way forward. This is how we can get to a world free from the threat of climate change. And we can definitely do it. We know it's in our grasp. So, let's keep working together. You too can protect what is left and repair what has been damaged. So help me spread the word by posting your support of the Paris Agreement. Thank you.
Welcome. We are so glad that you have found time today for the UN Day Forum taking action on climate change. First, our hosts. And our sponsors. All of this cannot happen without great people and organizations behind this good work. Hi, I'm Jill Christensen. I'm chair of the board of directors of the United Nations Association of the National Capital Area. Really glad that you have chosen time this afternoon to join us to celebrate UN Day. Actually, the 76th anniversary of the United Nations, as we focus on taking action on climate change. We have a dynamic 90-minute session planned for you. Lots of great resources, great information with people who know what they're talking about. This is something that works from the local level and what you can do to, in fact, the global level. So I'm glad you're here. And we're going to start with a very short message from the United Nations General Secretary, and that is Antonio Guterres. Please.
"76 years ago, the United Nations was created as a vehicle of hope for a world emerging from the shadow of a catastrophic conflict. Today, the women and men of the UN carry this hope forward around the globe. COVID-19, conflicts, hunger, poverty, and the climate emergency remind us that our world is far from perfect. But they also make clear that solidarity is the only way forward. we need to come together to tackle great challenges and advance the Sustainable Development Goals by ensuring that every person, everywhere, has access to COVID-19 vaccines sooner rather than later, by securing and upholding the rights and dignity of all people, especially the poorest and most disadvantaged girls and women and children and young people, by seeking an end to the conflicts that scar our world, by making bold climate commitments to save our planet and living up to them, and by building global governance that is more inclusive, networked, and effective, as detailed in my recent report, Our Common Agenda. The values that have powered the UN Charter for the last 76 years, peace, development, human rights, and opportunity for all, have no expiry date. As we mark UN Day, let's unite behind these ideals and live up to the full promise, potential, and hope of the United Nations.
And so we're here to, in fact, focus together on the power of the United Nations, but the impact of civil society, what you and me and your neighbors and your family, what we all can do to ensure that we do the right thing. With UN Day, there's a proclamation from President Biden. I'm going to start with, in fact, a few words from him, and when we close later this afternoon, I'll give you a few more. He says, the United Nations remains the most important forum of its kind for mobilizing collective action to resolve global problems, maintain international peace and security, advance human rights, promote health and well-being, protect the vulnerable and marginalized, and sustain a rules-based international order. So you've made your time. And now let's talk climate. I will mention that with the Secretary General, in August, they released the report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. In his own words, we were in nothing less than, quote, the code red for humanity. The alarm bells are deafening and the evidence is irrefutable. Here we are working together. With today's panel, you will hear a number of speakers, and with that, actually a very clear call from the Unitarian Universalists, various congregations who were involved. And I'll mention that within that faith group, one of the 7 principles that outline what they believe includes then the 7th principle, respect for the interdependent web of all existence, of which we are a part. When we consider climate change and climate crises in relation to the Sustainable Development Goals, these are systems in which we are truly interrelated. We're going to hear this afternoon from Tim Lattimer. Let me go ahead and give you an introduction for him before he begins to speak. And then we're going to have a conversation with him. And to get his best sense, he is key to the process in preparing for, in fact, the UN, the global meetings, COP26 in Glasgow that begin on October 31st. Tim, in many ways, lives at the intersection of environment and development, working at the local, the regional, and the global levels, with a career that spans 35 years, both in the public sector and the private sector. For, in fact, more than 2 decades, he's been with the Department of State. He's focused on environmental and economic issues in countries such as Costa Rica, Peru, Panama, Argentina, and the Philippines. He also has worked with the US mission to the United Nations. As he worked and was assigned to the State Department's Bureau of Oceans, Environment, and Science, he in fact led to the culmination, which was a part of, in fact, the Paris Agreement, the Paris Accord, which there'll be a lot of discussion about. He's here today in a personal capacity. He is also a local activist, has been head of his congregation, which is actually my congregation, the Unitarian Universalist Congregation in Columbia, but also then serves as coordinator for Indivisible for Howard County, Maryland, and then chair of the Columbia Association's Climate Change and Sustainability Advisory Committee. Tim, I pass it to you for some opening words. Go for it. We're so glad you're with us.
Well, thank you so much, Jill. I really do appreciate that very kind introduction. And I just want to thank the UNA, NCA, and all of the UU organizers behind today's event. So I'm really just delighted and honored to be with you and with this outstanding panel that you've assembled for today. At the outset, I should say, or just to reiterate, that any opinions I express today are my own and not necessarily those of the Department of State or the US government. And what I do professionally and in my engagement as a citizen is really informed by the values and principles that I hold dear as a Unitarian Universalist. So I very much appreciate the engagement of so many UUs and all of you who are working to promote climate action and justice, both here in the national capital area and around the country. So I suspect that if you're here today, it's because you already know that the climate crisis is real, it's serious, and we humans are the primary culprit. And we also know that this is a global problem that requires a global solution, but that strong local action is vital. And we have solutions. What we most need now is political will. So really, in the context of this being a global problem, the climate crisis is here. This is not a challenge for future generations, but one we are confronting right now, and we must address today. Tackling the climate crisis is an imperative, but also the greatest economic opportunity of our time, allowing us to create new jobs and new industries, delivering greater benefits for all. Now, the window for keeping the 1.5 degrees Celsius limit on warming, to keep that within reach, is narrowing. The world needs to cut emissions by at least 45% by 2030 in order to be on a credible path toward net zero emissions by 2050. So that makes this the decisive decade, and it makes 2021 a decisive year. None of us can go it alone. All of us need all of us to make it. And that means engaging with other countries in the processes that are laid out in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and in the Paris Agreement. So the 26th UN Climate Change Conference of Parties, COP26, which starts next week in Glasgow, is a pivotal moment for the world to come together and meet and master the climate challenge. So going into that, just to give you a very high level central US objectives for COP26, we want to be able to leave Glasgow with the world significantly more on track toward keeping a 1.5 degrees Celsius limit on warming within reach. We also want to emerge with a collective commitment from the parties to continue strengthening climate ambition, including by enhancing resilience and adaptation during this decisive decade. And we want to secure outcomes on the Paris rulebook that are in line with US interests and avoiding any outcomes that undermine transparency and environmental integrity in the elaboration of the Paris Agreement. Now, we also want to demonstrate that the US is back on climate, both in terms of our domestic action and in terms of our global leadership on climate. Beginning on the first day of his administration, President Biden has put climate change at the center of US foreign policy, diplomacy, and national security. And what we can anticipate with COP26 is a very strong US presence. President Biden will be there for the World Leaders Summit the first 2 days, November 1 and 2. We also expect that more than 10 cabinet rank officers will be there on the ground, including the Secretaries of State, Treasury, Energy, Agriculture, Interior, Transportation, and the Housing and Urban Development Department. We also expect that the administrators of the US Agency for International Development and the Environmental Protection Agency will be there, as well as the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and the director of the White House Office of Science, Technology, Policy. So it's going to be a pretty star-studded US delegation that's going to be at COP26. And all of that is to help advance the agenda that we have to show that not only we are taking action at home, but also we're engaging more robustly with the rest of the world. So we will be launching some new partnerships and initiatives. We will be engaging with civil society and the private sector. And we're going to be showing that we're taking a stronger commitment on financing for climate change. The president has proposed the quadrupling of the levels of international assistance on climate that we had during the Obama period to over $11 billion a year. And that will help us also towards stepping up our commitments and meeting our commitments to the Green Climate Fund. All of which is also aimed at mobilizing $100 billion a year, which is what the donor countries have agreed to in the past and that we are working to try to accomplish. We will also be announcing our national climate strategy, which outlines the US plans for achieving our nationally determined contribution for 2030, and our long-term strategy, which provides a summary of pathways to reach net zero emissions across the US economy no later than 2050. But the Conference of Parties is not the end of the story. It's an important step in what must be an ongoing and urgent effort to keep that 1.5 degrees Celsius target alive and to enhance adaptation and resilience. So that's just some opening parameters, and I'm happy to give it back over to Jill for a little bit of question and answer.
Thank you, Tim. You know, it's wonderful to hear that, in fact, it's all of us. Everyone makes that difference as far as addressing it. But truly, that the US will be very, very active and rolling out many different initiatives and having full presence there at COP26 in Glasgow. The US is back. I'm going to dive right in and dive it hard with a question for you before we go on to maybe even a softer question. We'll see. You know, recently with the United Nations Association National Capital Area, we had a wonderful event on human rights. And in fact, an American speaker who's with the Human Rights Council talked about other nations being very weary of American exceptionalism. We've had a long time of this American exceptionalism. Well, but, and the two-sided face of action compared to then what we say. With the state of relations with UN member states now, do you expect some challenges with that as far as pushback? And how do we get back to the US is back, the US is strong, and we believe in the Paris Accord?
Well, that's a great question, Jill. And I would say it starts with being able to show that we are taking action at home. I mean, we can talk the talk, but if we're not walking the walk, then our rhetoric wears thin on folks. So I can understand why there are some countries that may be weary of that notion of American exceptionalism. The one thing I draw a little bit of hope from is in recent months, there have been some polls put out by Gallup and Pew and others that show that the US standing in the world has improved markedly since January of 2021. And I think there is a willingness to engage with us more constructively, but there will always be pushback because when we go to these conferences, every country is there advancing their national interests. The US does it, every other party does it as well.
Yes.
Our challenge as diplomats is to find out where our national interests intersect and how we can help each other advance our respective national interests and, you know, work within the constraints that we have where our interests do not intersect.
That this is in all of our best interests, yes.
Exactly, exactly. And so most, according to recent polls, most around the world now see the US as a reliable partner, but perhaps no longer a model democracy. And that is something that I do worry about. So we do have some work to do toward restoring trust and goodwill.
Sure, thank you. You know, one of the things you have said, you know, we've got just a couple minutes here, is that all democracy and diplomacy, all diplomacy is local. And I want you to reflect on that and then also reflect on, is climate a social justice issue? You know, we have many people of faith within our listening right now, as well as those who do not believe, you know, and are not a part of faith organizations as agnostic or atheist. Is it a social justice issue? And then how does that diplomacy impact all of us?
So to the first part of your question, Jill, yes, I do like to say that all diplomacy is local. We cannot do on the international stage the things that we might need to do if we do not have support for it back home. That's just a reality. We cannot be out so far ahead of where the US public is on issues. So it's important that there be strong support for the kinds of actions we need to take, both domestically and internationally. As to your question about whether climate is a social justice issue, I would say it absolutely is. I mean, my own view is that we can't tackle the climate crisis effectively without also tackling the multiple crises that we face right here at home, both with our democracy and with racial and economic justice. And we've seen historically how marginalized groups and communities are the ones who suffer disproportionately when it comes to the impacts of climate change, whether it's the flooding or the prolonged heat waves, the other impacts that they have. I mean, those are the kinds of things that we see both here in the United States and around the world. It is the marginalized communities often who suffer first and worst when it comes to the impacts of climate change. So we have to recognize that and deal with it.
Absolutely. And I think that we all can point to multiple disasters and the impacts of that. So Tim, I want to thank you very much for being here, but also then in that professional capacity representing us within the international work that you do with State Department in preparing, and certainly knowing that there's work far beyond what happens in Scotland next week and the next couple of weeks. With that, why don't you go ahead and introduce our next speaker who will lead the panel for us.
Great, thank you, Jill. You're so kind, and I really do appreciate that. It's really a great honor and a privilege to be able to do what I do, and I'm very grateful for this opportunity. So whatever progress we may make internationally when it comes to climate change, it's clear that international agreements like Paris are only as good as the actions that we take at home, the actions we take by within each nation, and in particular, those that are on the front lines, our local communities. And that's why I'm so pleased to introduce my colleague, Dr. Nate Hultman. Few know more about how non-federal actors play such a vital role in achieving our national and global aims on climate. Now, Nate is a founder and director of the University of Maryland's Center for Global Sustainability and a professor in the School of Public Policy. He's participated in the UN climate process for nearly 25 years as a non-government observer, beginning with the Kyoto meeting in 1997. We first worked together during the Obama administration when I was first in the State Department's Climate Change Office, and Nate served at the White House's Council on Environmental Quality. At that time, he played a key role in developing the US 2025 climate target and was part of the US government's team that delivered the Paris Agreement in 2015. And after he went back to the University of Maryland, Nate was also the co-lead of the America's Pledge Initiative and lead author of reports produced in 2018 and 2019 on America's Pledge, documenting the impact of state and local climate action in the United States. He's currently on leave from the University of Maryland, serving as a senior advisor in the Office of Special Presidential Envoy for Climate at the Department of State. He also currently serves as president of the Board of Trustees for the Cedar Lane Unitarian Universalist Church in Bethesda, Maryland. He holds an MS and PhD in Energy and Resources from the University of California, Berkeley, and a BA in Physics from Carleton College. So Nate, over to you.
Great, thanks, Tim, and thanks, Jill, for framing this up for us, as well as to the UN Association of the National Capital Area and all the congregations who've been supporting, as well as the organizers. Tim, thank you also for those great comments. It was really, I think, very well said, very well framed up for our conversation that we're now about to embark on with a set of very distinguished and interesting panelists who I'm very excited to present to you and introduce to you now. I'm going to say also at the beginning, just like Tim, I'm at the State Department now, so nothing I'm saying now is representing the U.S. government. This is just I'm here in my personal capacity, so I just have to say that. I think, you know, just so we're all on the same page with this. But let me transition just to introduce our fantastic panelists. I'm super excited about the three of them that we'll be speaking with for the next roughly 30 minutes. So you all have online a deeper bio sketch for each of these panelists. I'm going to try to keep it very short to 1 minute. So we'll blitz through this, but there's lots more to say. So first, William Barber III currently works as the Strategic Partnerships Manager at the Climate Reality Project, a nonprofit based in Washington, D.C., whose mission is to catalyze global solutions to the climate crisis. He also serves as a member of the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality Secretary's Environmental Justice and Equity Advisory Board, as well as co-chair for the North Carolina Poor People's Campaign Ecological Devastation Committee. Most recently, he founded the Rural Beacon Initiative, LLC, a multi-member startup that provides consultation for groups looking to advance equity, climate justice, and environmental justice. Our second panelist, Ali Tharp, is the program director of the UU Ministry for the Earth, managing the denomination-wide Create Climate Justice Initiative, and is a member of the UUA organizing strategy team. Ali lives in Austin, Texas, and is a member of the Wildflower UU Church. Ali is also an arts and cultural organizer and food activist, working in her free time as a core volunteer with the Festival Beach Food Forest, a secretary board for the Serafina Food Pantry, and as a cook for the ATX Camp Support Coalition. Our third panelist today, Salote Soko, is the Senior Partnership Officer for Climate Justice and Crisis Response at the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee, leading a human rights portfolio focused on advancing human rights-based responses to issues affecting grassroots and frontline communities experiencing the risks of climate-forced displacement. She has 16 years of professional experience in the field of environmental management and climate justice, and a lifetime commitment to upholding the human rights of those who are unjustly experiencing the effects of environmental degradation and the climate crisis. Salote's inspiration for her work comes from the courage and determination of frontline communities like her own, who work tirelessly to protect their homes and their loved ones. So thank you so much, all three of you, for joining us for this panel. What we're going to do, just for the audience, I'm going to invite each of the panelists to provide just a few minutes of kind of an introductory comment from their perspective, both responding to Tim Lattimer's comment, but also kind of providing their own view on the climate crisis and the situation that we face, as well as possible solutions. After their opening comment, I'll do a bit of moderated discussion where I'll ask a few questions of the panelists, and then we will take a short break, go to another speaker for a few minutes, and then we will have Q&A. So we will get to your Q&As, but it'll be a little bit later. It'll be around after 5, just so everybody knows what's coming up. So thank you all. I'm going to actually start with William Barber III. William, would you like to give us your perspective on Tim's comments and also your own view?
Absolutely. Thank you, Nate. Thank you, Tim. Thank you for all the panelists and attendees today for having us. You know, I'm calling in from North Carolina, and I want to first honor that state, the legacy, the history of that state being the birthplace of the United States environmental justice movement, because that really speaks volumes to where we are in the middle of a current climate crisis, in the middle of a massive social justice movement for climate justice. We have to honor the veterans who laid a foundation of activism and on whose shoulders we stand to even be able to have this conversation today. You know, in response to where we are, response to what Tim laid out, you know, in 1967, Dr. King gave a speech called Beyond Vietnam, A Time to Break Silence. And it was in this speech in which he first articulated the concept of a fierce urgency of now, the idea that there was such a thing as actually being too late. And he urged the nation at the time to recognize that there was no time for apathy or complacency, but instead we were in the time where we needed vigorous and positive action. He said this in 1967. 54 years later, 2021, in the middle of a burgeoning climate crisis, these words ring true with renewed vigor. Our own generational fierce urgency of now. When we think of every young person who's imbued with the courage to recognize that their future is in the balance, there is a fierce urgency of now. When we think of every elder, every veteran who has been burdened with doubt of having done enough to prevent this crisis, there's a fierce urgency of now. When we think of every community, poor, Black, indigenous, coastal, rural, whose very existence rests in the balance of what we do, there is a fierce urgency of now. And for each of us who recognize that the climate crisis is the culmination of all the forms of oppression and injustice we have cultivated over the years, and how we address it will determine our ability to move forward together, there is a fierce urgency of now. You know, we must understand that the climate crisis is the existential crisis of our time. And in addition, this crisis serves as a multiplier on every social disparity that we have and currently face as a society. Everyone, from poverty, from gender inequality, from immigration rights, from food access, to racial equality, to the challenges with our democracy. The climate crisis, if unaddressed, threatens to exacerbate each of those social inequities. And when we talk about frontline communities being at the center of the conversation, marginalized communities, we have to recognize and atone as a society that these communities have not been marginalized just because that is the status quo, that is their existence. We have done this through blind spots in policy. We have marginalized communities. We have placed peoples on the front lines of this crisis. The great cruelty is that when we think about the climate crisis and our dependence on fossil fuels up to this point, together they have driven injustice around the world, putting the poor and most vulnerable in the pathways of some of the hardest and most deepening existing inequities. A current climate crisis is only possible because of generations of environmental injustice where fossil fuel infrastructure was placed overwhelmingly in poor communities and communities of color. We must think of this as the twin evils of injustice. And because of those legacies, these same communities, who, by the way, in some ways have contributed the least to the climate crisis, because we know poor communities per capita don't consume as much energy, therefore don't create as much of a demand for fossil fuel resources. But having contributed the least, they are nonetheless still on the very front lines, being hit, as was said, first and worst by this global reality. We must recognize this. We must recognize that this crisis is of such a scale that no one sector can address this issue on its own. Government cannot do this on its own. Community activism cannot do this on its own. The private sector, private investment, finance can't do it on its own. So we really must come to terms and embrace the lessons of intersectionality, of fusion politics, of, as Dr. King said, this inescapable web of mutuality that binds all life together and necessitates urgent and thoughtful action. We've experienced a little bit of this global solidarity in the wake, in the collective suffering that we've seen with this global pandemic of COVID-19. And in many ways, if we can get our response right with the pandemic, if we can understand the mutuality that binds us together through this pandemic, in some ways it's a precursor on a very small scale of what we will need to do in order to address this climate crisis. And in closing, you know, it is important for us, even though we are facing incredible challenge with this crisis, we must recognize the hope that exists in the midst of this challenge. When we look at the conversations that are being convened today, when we look at the activism that is happening at local communities, when we look at the new and innovative policy solutions that are being put forth, when we look at each other, that is our strength. The good news is that what happens next really is in our hands. This is a matter of political will. We know what got us into this mess, and we know we can get it out. We know that by leaving fossil fuels behind and making a truly just transition where we prioritize community ownership within frontline communities, we prioritize equitable access to clean energy and to green space. We know that by doing that, we can avoid the worst of a climate crisis and give all people and countries a chance at a healthy future. We know we have the tools to do it, to power our lives without destroying the planet. We know right now that Earth receives more energy from the sun every hour than humanity uses in a year. We know that globally, wind supply could supply the world's electricity needs 40 times over. We know we can afford to do this. Already renewables are the cheapest forms of new electricity generation for over 2/3 of the planet, and costs continue to fall. Best of all, we can make a just transition to clean energy that gets toxic fossil fuels out of our neighborhoods and creates green careers and pathways with the future in communities from Atlanta to Appalachia and beyond. And we can do this in a way globally where wealthier countries who have benefited from a global dependence on fossil fuel can undergird countries in the global south who are on the front lines of climate crisis right now in a way that solidifies resilience and boosts international cooperation. We know this. And we know that when we stand up, we stand together, systems change, movements change, this world changes, and we can address this moment in history. Thank you.
Yeah, that's right. I like that. Thanks, William, for those fantastic comments. What I'm going to propose we do is we're going to go next to Allie, and Allie, invite you to give a few comments of your own, and then we'll go to Salote for the first three, and then we'll talk about what we've learned from all three of these sets of comments after that. So Allie, over to you.
Thank you, Nate. And so thank you also so much, Mr. Barber, for your words. That was very moving. Well, I want to share that my entry into climate justice activism was 9 years ago. I was propelled into action by heartache, by outrage from witnessing the sheriffs in East Texas brutalize peaceful protesters who were blockading construction of the Keystone XL pipeline through my home in Texas. 9 years later, it breaks my heart, it shakes my confidence and my hope for the future that people like me are still resisting tar sands pipelines, are still being brutalized by officers of the state who are protecting the profits and property of a transnational corporation, leaving it to civilians to dedicate and risk our lives protecting the land, the water, and the climate. Internationally, the murder rates of land defense activists continue to rise year after year. And so when I hold this in my heart, I find myself asking, when will this tide turn? When will governments, banks, and asset managers and corporations stop pouring fuel on the fire, so to speak, of our ecological crisis? The great Frederick Douglass said in 1857 about working towards freedom from the evils of slavery, if there is no struggle, there is no progress. Those who profess to favor freedom and yet deprecate agitation are men who want crops without plowing the fields. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the awful roar of its many waters. This struggle may be a moral one, or it may be a physical one, and it may be both moral and physical, but it must be a struggle. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. 164 years later, we now know that plowing up the ground is not the best way to grow our crops. However, Frederick Douglass's words remain relevant and prescient to our times. The United Nations was founded 76 years ago with the aspiration of creating world peace through diplomacy, that we may never have a third world war. In this significant international forum, there is most certainly a moral struggle at hand with the climate crisis and the need for countries to increase their commitments and contributions if we are to reach even close to our shared goal of keeping global warming to below 1.5 degrees Celsius. The sad truth is that physical struggle is ever present in this issue as well, as the continuation of our reliance on fossil fuels, the continued construction of new fossil fuel infrastructure, the continued brutalization and death of land defenders, all of this is poisoning communities, displacing communities, shortening people's lives, and jeopardizing the future for all life on this planet. This is a physical and moral struggle. It's one of the greatest moral struggles of our time. And we must not forget that it is a struggle, and therefore we must be vigilant in our moral grounding and our commitments. Do we want climate justice without doing the hard work of transforming the foundations of our vastly inequitable fossil fuel reliant economy? Do we want climate justice without doing the hard work of committing to solidarity with the communities who are the most directly impacted by this crisis? How deep is our commitment to averting the worst possible outcomes of this crisis? How deep is our love? As people of faith and conscience, it's our sacred responsibility to commit to this struggle, to act with bold and prophetic imagination, to create a thriving world for future generations. To agitate by keeping the pressure strong on policymakers at the COP26, as well as at the national, state, and local levels, to do everything we can to create climate justice. Thank you.
Thank you, Ali, for those poetic words and reminding us about the need for demands on the powers that are causing this, the crisis we're facing, and tying into another theme that we've heard from all of our speakers about the deep links between what we're facing in climate and the perpetual challenges that we seem to have been facing on justice and related issues of equity. So thank you, Ali. Then to wrap our sort of opening section here, I'd like to turn to Solote. Please, Solote, could you share with us some of your thoughts?
Thank you so much, Nate. And respectful greetings to our audience. I'm so privileged to be here today representing the UU Service Committee and to be sharing this space today with Reverend William, Barber, and Ali. The UU Service Committee works in partnership with grassroots groups and organizations around the world to advance and protect the rights of people who are forcibly displaced from their homes by the climate crisis. So my statement will focus on what we're learning from our partners, because they are in many ways already facing what we're saying is the worst possible outcomes of the climate crisis. And also because it provides some more concrete examples and context to what Mr. Lattimer shared, and reflects where the gaps are in our responses and why our response must be rooted in human rights, justice, and equity. In the Pacific Islands, the issue of loss and damage and climate forced displacement has been around for the last 2 to 3 decades, and it's only getting worse. A half-degree increase in global temperatures mean that small island atolls like the Marshall Islands, Tuvalu, and Kiribati will need to raise their islands up to 4 feet by mid-century to protect them from tidal flooding. That's only 20 years away. The implications of this are grave and also exposes some of the historical issues that these islands experienced, particularly in the hands of US government policy. For instance, in the Marshall Islands, UU Service Committee's partners are not only calling on the US government to be ambitious in our greenhouse gas emissions reductions, but to also take responsibility for the nuclear waste that is stored in the Runit Dome, which due to sea level rise is seeping more radioactive waste toxins into the nearby waters that communities rely on for their basic human needs. For folks that are not aware of this history, the United States government used the Marshall Islands to test over 60 nuclear bombs between the 1940s and late 1950s. In countries like mine in Fiji and in Vanuatu, planned relocation due to climate change is already in government policy. The Fiji government has identified 48 communities that need to move within the next 10 years. This was identified almost 5 years ago. Our partners in other countries are already actively relocating their communities or are planning for that. In Papua New Guinea, the Carteret Islands identified in the 90s that they needed to move due to food shortage that was caused by saltwater intrusion of their arable lands. No government assistance was provided to support their relocation. They had to find land by themselves in a land that is itself reeling from a violent and bloody civil war. There was no international intervention from the United Nations during the initial years. International media have referred to them as the world's first climate refugees, which isn't even a category under international refugee law. But we also don't have to go outside our borders to witness these injustices, as pointed out by Mr. Tim Lattimer. Right here in the United States, our partners and tribal leaders in Alaska and Louisiana are experiencing flooding due to storms, land collapse due to melting permafrost, and land erosion without any measures to protect themselves from these hazards. And these impacts are forcing many communities to seek relocation. The forced displacement of people due to climate change impacts are happening today, and those who are most affected are Black and Brown Indigenous people of color. The US government does not have any policy to address climate forced displacement within the United States. There is no relocation fund. There is no dedicated federal agency to address this issue. There isn't an international legal framework to protect the rights of people crossing borders due to climate change impacts. There is no dedicated multilateral funds to support developing island nations like the Pacific to handle the financial cost of the burdens of the climate crisis that is affecting their homes and their citizens. The funds that they are receiving through foreign assistance, such as the USAID, through multilateral funds like the GCF, Green Climate Fund, isn't enough. And it's not getting into the hands of those that need it the most, like our grassroots groups. And these are opportunities for us to meet. I'll hand it back there. I'll end it there and hand it back to Nate.
So thank you so much for those comments. Again, tying into the need to address the fundamental underlying issues that are facing us, that are manifest already, but exacerbated significantly by climate change, and also for the very helpful, concrete sort of list of gaps that we currently have not addressed in terms of redressing those problems that are acute. So thank you all three of the panelists for those comments, all thought-provoking, all heartfelt and moving. What I'd like to do, we have a short amount of time that we can discuss a little bit with each other. And I'd like to certainly invite the panelists to interact with each other to the extent we can on Zoom. It's always a little hard, but let's give it a try. And then again, I'm just to those in the audience listening and participating in the chat, thank you for that. We will get to a Q&A segment of the session a little bit after 5 p.m. So that'll come up in a few minutes. So what I'd like to do is now turn just to our panel and invite you all to kind of think about and answer, hopefully briefly, on this one question. So you've all identified in some way or another a kind of problem. Like, we've got a gap. We see the climate crisis. It's as Reverend Barber said, it's a fierce urgency of now kind of question. It's burning. It's happening today. We're not where we need to be. And the COP meeting, the climate conference coming up in a week, is a very visible reminder. It's a deadline. It's saying, like, have we done enough by next week? The answer will be, I'm sorry to say, no. And we have made some progress. Tim laid out some of the areas that there has been progress, and I'm happy to sort of come back to that question later. But we're not going to be over the line on November 1st, on next Monday, a week from Monday. So with that in mind, you've each touched on a really significant issue and how it sort of issues and how they relate to climate and how they relate to justice questions. How do we scale up from what we have today to achieve the level of action that we know we need to get to by, say, not just next week, but something like next year, right? Like, what is the agenda of scaling up that we need to be thinking about? So why don't I go in reverse order from the panel? Sorry, Salote, I'm going to put it on you first. And we can have a little conversation about that. It doesn't have to be, long comment, but just sort of, how do you think about that? How should we be thinking about where we are today? There's a gap. How do we use the energy that we're all seeing? We're all feeling that energy. There's energy there to do something more, but how do we then scale it to the level we need? So just a few musings on this. We're not going to solve the whole problem, but maybe Salote, over to you for some thoughts.
Yeah, thanks, Nate. Well, I think the first thing that we need to do is just to listen to those that are most directly affected. In many ways, they hold very tangible, very practical solutions that we can work on in the short term, even within a year. I know for many of the communities that we're working with, resourcing the strategies that they hold to revitalize the solutions that they know will work on the ground is something that they are actually calling for. And I think that's the first place to start. We can scale that up and figure out how that looks in policy. UUSC has already done some of that analysis, but the first thing that we need to do as people of privilege and access to these many spaces and many resources is to start listening to those on the ground. Resourcing is important, getting their voices to COP26. There's like a third of the Pacific that can't be at COP26 because of COVID-19. That's an inequity right there. So listening to them, making sure that we use our voice and our access to channel their voices and their demands is something practical and tangible that I think we can all work towards.
Great. Allie.
I want to share a link with everyone to the Beautiful Solutions project. And there's a former moderator of the UUA, the great and late Alandria Williams, who's an editor of the Beautiful Solutions project and the book with the same name. And these are many, many stories of community-based solutions, people who are transforming their local economies to be resilient, to be climate adapted and regenerative. And so there's just dozens of inspiring examples and solutions that you can find on this website. And that's what I want to point people to today. And I also want to just lift up the Deadline Glasgow campaign from the Stop the Money Pipeline Coalition that the UU Ministry for Earth is a part of, and call on, we can get to scale by divesting from economy and investing in an ecological economy and a just transition. Like Mr. Barber said earlier, we really need that transformation of what we put our money towards, and seeing that happen, in your personal and congregational levels to switch where your investments are and invest in the just transition will help us get to scale. Thank you.
Yeah, William, what are your thoughts?
Absolutely, Nate. Thank you. And, just to add on this, I think we need to really recognize that there's, in the midst of this, a remarkable coalescence of intelligence and opinion that's happening around these issues that is really, quite unprecedented. When you look at some of the equity metrics that have been laid out that are there, we really need to educate and re-educate ourselves on some of what is an existing precedent. When we think about the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the 17 Principles of Environmental Justice, the non-ratified Escasa Agreement, there are so many well thought out documents and pathways to understanding the intersection of both these issues, these crises, and also to put forth solutions that recognize that intersectional approach that we really need to bring to the forefront and include in our policy discussions. Two of the areas that I really focus on and would encourage us to focus on as we have the conversation today are, one, again, community ownership. How do we implement that and operationalize that in our climate solutions and policy? And two, thinking about how religious groups and institutions can be an incredibly powerful force for a livable planet. Too often, these two groups have been portrayed as in dissonance to one another. But when you look at religious groups and scientists, they can be an incredibly powerful force for addressing this crisis. There have been some 1,200 institutions that have committed right now to divest from fossil fuel companies, totaling somewhere around $14.5 trillion. 1/3 of those are faith-based organizations. So these, when you think about religious institutions across the many faith spectrums, Christian, Hindu, Buddhist, Islam, agnostic, these can be bastions of inspiration, both for action and, as we face this incredible challenge, forums for mass education, mass advocacy for policy on the climate issue. When we talk about community ownership, I think we really need to think through that energy-related assets, such as energy generation systems, energy storage systems, energy efficiency systems, and cooling and heating systems can be collectively owned and managed by their users in a way that boosts not only a solution to the climate crisis, but boosts the underlying community resilience, which is needed when we talk about communities being on the front lines of increased extreme weather, of increased consequences of a climate crisis that has gone too long. We have to understand that cost sharing, community model ownership models enable participants to own these energy assets, contribute to community energy development, and help them scale up resilience and renewable infrastructure. And then finally, I think we need to look at policy platforms that are really taking this conversation seriously. We know that President Biden back in January issued an executive order creating the Justice 40 initiative, directing federal agencies to work with states and local communities to provide 40% of federal investments and climate benefits to go to frontline communities. We need to really take that conversation seriously and not just have it be in words, but ask the question, how do we actually operationalize that? We need to look at some of the critical investments of the budget bill, such as the $30 billion that was put to replace lead pipes and ensure Americans have access to clean water. That it may seem like an environmental injustice issue, but as the climate crisis continues to manifest, that will continue to be a climate issue. And that has disproportionately affected Black and brown populations. We need to look at the $10 billion to clean up toxic Superfund sites. We need to look at the $5 billion to help states tackle environmental justice issues in local communities. We need to look at these carve-outs and understand how they are not building to the aggregate, not just building to the aggregate in climate solutions, but are advancing equity and justice, because that is the foundational pin which will allow us to win on this issue. And finally, we need to look at innovative models. I'm very supportive of the Federal Climate Accelerator, which has been put forth in the Build Back Better infrastructure, which looks to seed not only green banks as a vehicle to advance climate investment in distressed areas, but also has inadvertently become one of the most ambitious investments in environmental justice when you look at the carve-outs there. And so those are real, concrete, serious solutions that not only address the tenets of looking at the crisis and how it intersects with existing social disparities, but puts resources in the communities that need it the most. And in doing that, build a foundation of justice that allows us to actually solve this thing.
Thank you. And those were three really kind of inspiring and outstanding ways for us to be thinking about how to do this scaling and why we should think, there's opportunity at hand, echoing the idea that there is something new in the air in some ways about how to kind of integrate these challenges and address them as a kind of coherent whole in some ways. So I just deeply I'm grateful for those comments and the leadership that each of you has been bringing and is going to continue to bring in the next week before COP26. I shouldn't have said we still got work to do this week. So let's do the work this week. Let's do what we can at COP26. And I think it's going to be, a partial victory. We will get some of the way there. But I know that these problems are thorny, they're tough. And I think we are going to need this kind of deep work that all three of you identified in your comments, and that listening, the kind of working, the integration as part of the way we solve this problem. And so thank you for the perspectives on those. It has frankly been my great privilege to be able to listen to you all, bring your experiences and your ideas in this panel part of the event today. I'm deeply grateful for that. I am going to have to move to our next phase of the event shortly. But I do want to just on behalf of everybody here, thank you all for the leadership you've been doing and are continuing to show. We need it desperately. So thank you for that. So with that, what we're going to do is turn the page to a short presentation by Doris Marlin. And let me introduce Doris briefly here. And Doris, I'll hand over to you just very quickly. But so people know who you are. So Doris is the Unitarian Universalist Association Civil Society Delegation Head for COP26 in Glasgow. She's leading the UUA's delegation. Doris and the delegation will channel attention toward the social justice and UUSC UUA priorities that fulfill the US fair share of the Green Climate Fund, dedicate funding for loss and damages, and submit nationally determined contributions consistent with the goal of preventing warming that exceeds 1.5 degrees. Doris has been a Unitarian Universalist since 1985 and a board member of the Unitarian Universalist Ministry for Earth. So Doris, with that, over to you.
Thank you so much, Nate. Yes, hello, good afternoon. I am Doris Marlin. I come to you with an academic background in water resources management, professional experience in environmental project management nationally and internationally, and also with my values grounded and aligned with our Unitarian Universalist 8 principles. Slides, please. So to me, this slide says it all. The first slide, this is Bradley. He's 6. I met him out in front of the White House last week. And Bradley said to his mom, I shouldn't have to do this. I should just get a clean earth to live on. How true. There is a universe of actions that we all can take, but I am here to just mention a few, and they are by no means the full list, and also tie those actions to COP26. The actions I'll mention, what are arguably the most important actions that any of us can take, and they are, well, to hold our temperatures below and as tightly as possible to the historic levels, increase ambition, influence policymakers, and do so with equity and justice at the forefront. But also, what are the most important things to you that you can do? Well, what you are passionate about, what you will follow through with, and what will sustain you. And to also use your sphere of influence locally and nationally to move action. So I'm going to touch on 5 levels of action. Next slide, please. That essentially look at the individual, your personal action, things you can do at the local level, the state, and the national level. Next slide. Now, what your impacts will be will vary, but it's arguably how we influence our national policy makers and industry leaders, corporations that seem to do the most. Next slide, please. All of that within the economic sectors, such as what does aviation do? What is the shipping industry doing? All of those contribute greatly beyond our own personal influence. Next slide. And with that, we also need an all of society. We need to engage all of society to take action. So next slide. So initially, it was mentioned that the Green Climate Fund the US falls short of our obligations. And so there is a link you can go to immediately send a request to your elected representatives to fund the US fair share of the Green Climate Fund. Next slide, please. And why should we do this? Well, because the US has historically been the greatest greenhouse gas emitter. And so we arguably have the greatest obligation to fund the areas and support the countries who have done the least. Next slide, please. You can all, and here is the link, and that will be posted in the chat and also in follow-up emails that you will receive, along with all of the links I'm sharing today. Next slide. Also, sadly, we were hoping that we would have had a robust 2 infrastructure bills passed by this time. That is not the case. That needs to happen without any cuts, because it is our path to achieving as closely as we possibly can get to staying below 1.5 degrees. And to do so, we need to reduce our fossil fuel emissions by 50% by the year 2030. Next slide, please. So do follow that link and do write to your congressional representatives. At the personal level, you can continue to be engaged with COP26 for the duration of COP26. How you do that can be found at the link above. Next slide, please. You can also contact your local representatives, because in the end, all politics is local. If we do not get a robust infrastructure bill, yet again, the responsibility to do the most will fall to our cities and states. So there is a campaign called Strengthen Local Climate Commitments. You're invited to participate. Next slide, please. And next slide, please. And lastly, at the individual level, you can join in with a campaign that pulls together the solutions of Project Drawdown, next slide please, with your own Unitarian Universalist values within your own community, so that even though if you plant just one tree, that may not feel like doing much, but our collective effort on science-based measurable actions to slow climate change, collectively we can make a difference. So far during this initiative, you can see some of the stats that I've posted here. We have measurably saved 7,100 pounds of CO2. We've collectively planted over 100 trees and much more. Next slide, please. You can stay engaged with the happenings at COP26 by following the updates. Also posted at that link. Next slide, please. And in closing, I just love this quote: "We don't inherit the earth, we borrow it from our children." And all of the panelists you've met today have given very compelling reasons and given us an update as to why this is so important. Back to you, Nate. Thank you so much for the opportunity to participate.
Thanks, Doris, and thanks for your leadership taking the delegation or helping the delegation at COP26, as well as communicating back. I expect you will be communicating back what's going on there, as well as for laying out some options for people who are interested in knowing what to do or getting ideas for what could be done even this week. And I will double down on that point. On, the United States, Tim mentioned at the beginning, it is very important for us to get our act together to be able to help or encourage other countries to also raise their ambition to address climate crisis. We are doing a lot from the grassroots through state and local, through non-governmental organizations, all the way up to the federal government. There is a lot happening, but we also have made a very ambitious target for 2030, 50 to 52% reductions below 2005 levels, as well as the 2050 net zero goal that Tim mentioned earlier. Those are really tough to get to, and the legislation being discussed in Congress is relevant to that. And so to the extent people can work on that this week, that's good. But also your other point about this is an all of society, many people have raised this point. This is an all of society challenge. And so that requires all of the kind of listening and engagement pieces. It also requires us to get our governments involved and engaged at all levels, and all of our organizations, no matter what they are, to get them thinking about the climate crisis and addressing it in some way. And that means state and local governments. It means our faith communities. It means cultural institutions, museums, universities. It means lots and lots of things like that. So thanks, Doris, for kind of laying that out there. And I'm just giving boost to that concept that there's a lot that we can be doing. A lot of people are already doing a lot of things which have actually put us in a much better place in 2021 than even we were in 2017, despite lots of setbacks at the federal level. So all of that's just for the good, and sorry to go on a little bit too long there. Anyway, thank you for that. So let's do this. We do have some time for Q&A, about looks like about 15 minutes or so. There is a Q&A function in the Zoom box that you have in front of you all. You can put your questions in that Q&A box, and we will do our best to get to at least some of those very good questions. I see a torrent of them coming in now. So I'd like to start though with one. There's plenty of good ones here. So again, I'm going to ask, this is going to be to everybody now. It's so Doris, Tim, William, Solote, Ali. Anybody can jump in if you feel so motivated. But one of the questions that came in, actually two I'm going to lump together, and I'm going to highlight maybe first to Salote, but then others should feel free to pipe in. One of them was about how best to integrate human rights into the climate conversations at the COP, and I would interpret that maybe even a little more broadly. Salote, you've worked a lot on that. You made some comments about that, but maybe you could speak a little bit to that specific question from that person. And then there was a linked question that I think is, directly, but not exactly the same. But so that was from Lisa Caroline Peterson, and then Noor Trebelsi asked a question about migration and how we should think about migration being a linked issue with the climate crisis, and what, again, we might be able to do to kind of tie those pieces together. So maybe Salote, to you and others I know have thoughts about this as well.
Sure. Thank you, Nate, and thank you for that question. When it comes to linking human rights and climate change, especially at the COP, it's already linked. I mean, the Paris Agreement in its preambular language talks about human rights and how important it is for human rights to be integrated in the climate discussions, in both climate solutions, as well as how to go about addressing climate change, particularly for state parties. So it is in that document. The UN Human Rights Council has also passed in its 2 resolutions within the past 5 years, language about how climate change is in fact a human rights issue. So these are tools that we as grassroots, as advocates can use in our advocacy to hold our governments accountable. They are tools that we can use to push for policy within our national governments and so forth. But there are existing documents that are adopted by countries, state parties, including the United States, that are out there that define these linkages. When it comes to climate change and migration, the president, I believe last week, just released a report around climate change and migration, and how the United States government can address this issue at home, but also globally. So there are a couple of recommendations that the UU Service Committee is really happy about, such as just bringing together agencies that work on national security, climate change, and immigration issues to put their heads together to try and address this problem. But we feel it also falls short on some of the concrete ways that we can be tackling this issue. But there are several reports that are recognized by countries. The Global Compact for Migration, for instance, is also sort of an international regional mechanism that links climate change and other forces or drivers of migration together. So these are existing policies. There are discussions that are happening both at the international and as well as within this administration that we should be really glad for, but there needs to be more action to actually provide solutions to people on the ground.
Thank you, Salote. I'm going to go ahead and just move on to the next question, because I think you gave a lot of good detail on that one. So let's just make sure I'm going to try to just make sure we get to as many as we can. So I'm going to go to a question that we have from Heidi Mordorst, who asks, what can we effectively do this week and during COP26? What's our most powerful move as individuals or as congregations? That's a question for anybody.
Well, I will immediately and briefly say, do not let the infrastructure bill related to climate get gutted. Keep it strong, keep it robust. That is our best hope for keeping global temperatures below 1.5 degrees.
Other thoughts on what we can do as individuals, congregations, or maybe even other organizations people are part of?
Well,
I would
I
add.
want to.
Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead, Tim.
No, go ahead, Allie.
How about we
So
go
just-
Allie and then Tim? Yeah.
Okay. Just quickly, I just posted a link in the chat to a Ministry for Earth webpage with an invitation. Doris and one of our other board members is hosting like a model United Nations where we can learn more about the positions nations are taking at COP26. This page will be updated with Doris when she's there, giving updates, and so please come on the 28th at 6 p.m. Eastern, I believe, 7 p.m. Eastern, to this Model UN, and just kind of coming back together as people of faith conscience on this issue. And keep your eye on that webpage for more updates, for reports on the ground from our UU representatives and partners who are there.
So I would add also that perhaps the most impactful thing one can do, not just this week, but going forward, is to make your voices be heard. Speak up, and especially when it comes to reaching out to your legislators. And if you're concerned about legislators in other districts or other states, if you have friends or family members in those districts or states, invite them to also speak up on these issues. And I would say really just talk about it. This issue is going to be in the news a lot over the next 3 weeks. But beyond that, we have to keep talking about it. We have to tell the truth. We have to talk about the existential threats that we face and what we need to do collectively to tackle that. And if we don't talk about it, then it's easy to push it away and easy for us to fall into sort of the issue of the day. And I think it's just important for us to stay engaged and keep talking about it.
Great, thank you, everybody. Let's see. So I forgot who asked this question, and now there's so many I can't find it again. But I'll find it in a sec. So one question that came in, which is on a similar track, but I think is important in terms of our overall strategy to kind of deal with this challenge, is the question was, how can we educate our elected leaders to better understand about not just the kind of superficial dimensions of the climate crisis, if I can put it that way, but I'm adding to the question now, but the undergirding elements of like what is driving all of this stuff. How can we as individuals, as congregations, as actors in other organizations, how can we educate? And I would even invite us to think more broadly about our relationship with our elected leaders and how we kind of work on those relationships, perhaps elect different leaders that could be more sympathetic or more understanding. So I'd like to also just throw that question out sort of broadly. How do we think about our communications with elected leaders, not just on kind of the urgency of like getting the reconciliation and the package done, but also in the kind of medium term of like changing what our elected leadership looks like?
Nate, to jump in here, I think, there are a couple of things we really must prioritize. One is actually demystifying some of those interactions, especially when we're talking about amplifying and elevating the voices of frontline communities, into the conversations, and not in a way where we're speaking on behalf of frontline communities, but we're actually connecting the conversations where frontline leaders are speaking and making their own case, building their own narrative to elected officials who can be then responsive to the need that they illustrate. I also think, narrative is a crucial component, I think sometimes underappreciated when we talk about both social organizing, but also the dissemination of policy. We really have to get the narrative right. For me, I sit at the intersection of climate policy, climate activism, but also climate academia and scholarship. And we really have to get the narrative right. What I mean by that is a lot of times our policies prioritize, rightfully so, the effects that we'll see in terms of emissions reduction, in terms of keeping us within the window of 1.5 degrees C, in terms of how do we actually deploy innovative climate technologies or energy generation technologies. But we have to make sure we prioritize to what end. So when we're talking about, again, the connections of equity and justice, we have to say that those human metrics for success are equally as important as the metrics we use to see traditionally if we've reached, our reduction goals. We have to continue to hammer that narrative. And when we're talking about equity and justice, we have to make sure that we're ensuring that that doesn't just happen kind of abstractly in policy, but when we're actually looking at process. So when we're looking at COP, we have to talk about how are the conversations being held in an equitable way in this moment where we're reeling still globally from a COVID-19 pandemic. We have to talk about the reality that there is going to be an inequitable lack of access for many countries from the front lines to be able to get representation to COP. So how is that being addressed? And it is on us as congregations, as activists, as individuals to help change the aggregate narrative by using every opportunity and every platform that we have to hammer that home and amplify that.
May I just add, thank you so much, Dr. Barber. In the Strengthen Local Climate Commitment campaign that I mentioned that there is a link to, we stress that on using the model that was used in Providence, Rhode Island for their climate justice plan, we stress how important it was to build those relationships that built the plan, that follow through monitoring the implementation, that make sure that all of the metrics and the targets and the interim targets that are set in that plan continue to be met, followed, and if they are not, then the plan is adjusted to do so. Accountability.
Absolutely. And that's been being done in so many innovative policies. When you look at the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, for example, and there have been several concerns about, histories of hotspotting and the burden that placed on communities. States have led the way in really building in metrics that operationalize equity and EJ concerns. Virginia law mandated that 50% of RGGI revenues would go to programs that improve energy efficiency and lowered bills for low-income households. Pennsylvania codified a set of equity goals as mandatory rules for participation that included gathering input specifically from disadvantaged communities, making sure that environmental and structural racism were not replicated in the engagement process, and equitable distribution of all the economic benefits that might result from a RGGI program. So when we talk about operationalizing these equity and justice goals, it's not just an abstract concept. It has to be directly tied to the success and really to the ability of the programs to move forward. So.
I think that's a great point, and thanks both of you for speaking to each other and not having me intercede between you. So it's great when we can start to do that. And of course, we're just kind of closing it to the end of our session here, but we're getting there. But I want to pick up on this concept. I think is really something I'm also very convinced is essential here, and I want to kind of lift that up a little bit here. We sometimes talk of our states as the laboratories of democracy, right? It's an imperfect metaphor, but it's a helpful metaphor, right? The laboratories of our democracy. We are living the laboratories of our democracy. There's a lot of reason that right now we're feeling frustrated about that, and I think people have mentioned that, and frustrated with kind of good reason. But ultimately, in the climate space, we are seeing this kind of William's comment about, like, we've seen this kind of innovation happening. Innovation we often think of as something that happens in technologies, and that's true, and we want that, and we need technologies for climate. So innovation on that front is essential and necessary. But we also have to be thinking of innovations in our policy formulation, innovations in how we interact with each other, innovations in how these policies are kind of done. And actually, Doris, your point about the metrics, right? Like kind of how to set up a policy on a climate related topic that fundamentally addresses some of these other undercurrents that we've been talking about. We don't know all the answers to how to do all that stuff. We just don't. I mean, we have some good ideas, but we're making in some degree, we're making this up as we go along, but we got to go faster. And so this is where having all that creative energy from all those different organizations, the different levels of government all over the board, that's going to be part of what helps us, because we will be able to find models that might work. They might not be universally applicable, but they might work in certain kinds of contexts, right? So that kind of broad innovation that we're all talking about, that energy that you've been hearing about today, with a lot of different groups working on it, thinking about it, innovating on it, that's going to be part of how we do it as well. And I think that was sort of the core of these last two comments, and one that I think is going to be critical. So I use my moderator's privilege to make another point there. So we're almost at the end of our time. I did promise all of the 5 panelists that I would ask them one final question in 5 words or less. What gives you hope? What gives you hope? And I'd like to just do a real quick lightning round. By the way, they might not have all seen that in the chat, so who knows? We'll see. But you can give your best guess. And so I'm going to just start with Allie. What gives you hope? And then we'll just go Allie, Tim, Doris, William, and Salote, and then we'll hand over back to Jill.
The spirit of life has staying power. One thing that gives me hope is that coral reefs have gone functionally extinct from the fossil record in the past, and they have re-evolved because life itself has staying power.
Tim.
What gives me hope is the power of the people.
Doris.
What's the alternative?
Yeah. William, what gives you hope?
You know, when I look at the activism of so many young people who are driving this conversation, stepping up and connecting it to a legacy of activism, and when I see this incredible, this incredible coalescence of intelligence and opinion centered around bridging innovation and equity, I'm very, very strongly encouraged that we're going to meet this challenge.
Thank you. And Salote, what gives you hope?
What gives me hope is the unrelentless power of activists around the world, especially in the global south, to survive and thrive in this climate chaos.
Thanks to all of you for the great Q&A, great panels, and comments from all of you. It's my last duty now to just hand the baton over to Jill to wrap us up.
Bravo. Thank you very, very much, Nate, for your moderating, for the hope that you allowed us to close on. It's so very, very important. And I want to just very quickly encapsulate some of what these wonderful minds and activists have been able to say during this afternoon. First off, Nate, you were able to ask us questions that were so very important. How do we scale up? What's the most powerful move we can take? How do we educate? Those are key questions. So many resources that have been offered. Tim, you started us out with, this takes all of us, and it does. The 110 people that have been on this web event, and our neighbors, our friends, those that in fact are maybe facing the rising waters in Tuvalu, in Fiji and Togo, all of them are so very important. William Barber III, you talked about the urgency of now, and that the climate crisis is the multiplier effect as far as inequities that we're dealing with right now that are historical, that we've got to address. Ali Tharp, you talked about land defense activists and how every year they're being killed. And every year, more people are standing up and saying, stop. Thank you for your activism, which began with Keystone Pipeline. Salete Soko, very much we heard your words and the importance of listening. And specifically then, Black, Brown, and Indigenous people who are the most impacted by the climate crisis. With this, Doris Marlin, as citizen headed to Glasgow, leading in fact that aspect of civil society and the importance of engagement of civil society. Your words about the universe of actions that we all can take, including 5 and a multitude of resources. Thank you. And let's talk resources for a moment. Following today's session, I'm not talking about right now, I'm talking about within 2 days or so, everyone who's been online will get a list of resources that have been offered. It's been actually so exciting to watch the chat and watch the Q&A going on throughout this session. What's clear is that we have impassioned, engaged, intelligent people that have been a part of this process who care about sharing what is happening with climate far beyond their own network and truly making a difference. Tim, it does have to do with talking to local leaders and talking at our kitchen tables so that in fact, the discussion of climate happens. You know, right now there's this whole multitude, almost a cacophony of information about climate. all in lead up in preparation to, in fact, Glasgow, the COP26. It might settle down after November, and yet what we know is that our work can't settle down. The work absolutely continues. A lot of visibility going on that you're going to see in Glasgow, but there's a lot beyond that too. And so be ready for the long haul, because this is truly our future. And as Chief Seattle said, the future of our children. Whereas I, many years ago, worked with the Mohawk Nation. It's the 7 generations, the 7 generations behind us who got us to today, October 24th, 2021. And the 7 generations of all of us ahead that, in fact, we are creating and shaping the world of tomorrow. So very, very essential. As we close, first off, I will let you know that next up with the United Nations Association of the National Capital Area is on October 28th. I know we've already heard about a really important event on October 28th. This happens before that one, which is actually at 4:30 in the afternoon. The United Nations Development Program Administrator, Achim Steimer, will be speaking to the UN Association of the National Capital Area. We would love you to join. And also, we are going to be launching the Global Goals at Home initiative. This takes those sustainable development goals that all of our nations, including the United States, agreed upon, and puts it into that local context of what's happening within the D, DC, M, Maryland, and V, Virginia area. The Global Goals at Home. So that's on October 28th. You'll find information on our website about that. I very much want to say again, thank you to the hosts that helped organize today. In addition to the United Nations Association of the National Capital Area, we had UU congregations of Cedar Lane, River Road, All Souls Unitarian, UU Church of Arlington, and the UU Congregation of Columbia, plus UU for Social Justice. Very much, this is about all of us. This is, in fact, today, one faith group that led. What we know is that there's incredible innovation happening across faith groups. Watch for future iterations of this that we do in the process. And lastly, I'm going to close with words from our president from his Proclamation for United Nations Day 2021. As I read, think climate. It is to celebrate the United Nations Day. We are at an inflection point in history. The choices we make in the next few years, whether or not we come together to face our greatest global challenges, will determine our future for the decades to come. The United States stands firmly in support of the United Nations and will continue to rally the world to action, not just with the example of our power, but with the power of our example. So let us all continue to walk the talk, be the change that we wish to see in the world, and to keep communicating, whether that is at the dinner table, across the pews, at the grocery store, and with our elected officials. Thank you very much, panelists. It's been superb. Sponsors, our fiscal sponsors for today, thank you so much too. Have a great afternoon. Bye-bye.